Are you confused about your leadership development plan? Not sure how to start or what we're expecting of you? If so, then this presentation is for you. It's the first in a series of presentations to help clarify the assessment task and to get you started towards a good development plan. The plan is actually in two parts. There's a written component of 1,400 words and an audio-visual component of no more than 2 minutes. The way that we're going to assess you is by way of a rubric, assessment rubric, which is published in my RMIT on the Assessment Tasks tab folder and also described in your course guide. You can see from this rubric that there are 4 aspects of the report that we will assess and allocate marks for. So let's go through these 4. The first is a clear description of, and importantly, a justification for your leadership development plan. So you're writing a plan that describes where you're going to be as a leader in the future and how you're going to get there and why you identified the things that you want to develop as being important. Things you should consider are, how did you actually diagnose your current strengths and weaknesses? What diagnostic tool did you use? And what characteristics of leadership did you examine for strengths and weakness? That's quite a complex component. That probably is the major part of your report. Are you utilising an existing model of leadership? For example, on my RMIT, we've given you 3 leadership competency models, and that would give you a very robust foundation on which to base your own leadership development plan. So are you going to choose one of those 3 or one of the many more available in the literature, or will you develop your very own competency model? I would strongly recommend not developing your own because it's an enormous amount of work. You won't get any more marks for doing so. So why not base it on something that has been published and has been tested? So I recommend the 3 in my RMIT, but you're also welcome to venture out further into the literature if you can find something that's more suitable for you. Because the plan is about you and your own development, you need to think about the industry that you're going to be working in, if you're not already working. What is it about that industry environment that might suggest that you need particular leadership skills? You know, you could be an engineer, you could be a management person working in a creative arts field, you could be an accountant. Whatever you expect to be doing, think about that industry, the culture and the environment, and how that might influence the kinds of leadership skills that are important for that field. Again, because the plan is about you, your very own plan, what is it about you that will influence your plan? Now, an obvious one is gender. We talk a bit about gender in this course and the impact of gender on leadership effectiveness and leadership style. So do you think being male or female has an influence on how you should develop as a leader? You might think it's not important. If so, say so. If you think it is important, describe why and justify it. What about your age and level of experience? Is age relevant? Is it true that as we grow older, we become more experienced, more worldly? So a discussion about that is probably important. And culture, your own culture, which might include your background, your country of birth, your religion, your language, and also the culture of the environment you expect to work in. So that's a little bit similar to the industry-specific issue we just discussed above. How do all those aspects of yourself influence your leadership plan? Now, it's a plan, so there obviously is an endpoint. So what stage will you get to within 2 years, within 5 years? Do you expect that you can instantly become an effective leader, or will it take a period of time? Are there multiple stages or steps in your plan? And how did you decide what was a realistic time for each of those steps or stages? The final bit of this first part of the assessment is, how did you actually evaluate your plan? Or how will you evaluate it in the future? When you get to the 2-year point, what is it that you'll measure to know that you're on track towards being an effective leader? What evidence and literature can you draw upon to develop that evaluation? So that's the big bit, part 1 of the assessment. Part 2 is, what key theory and practice papers, ideas, thoughts, literature have you cited and have, importantly, you've formatted according to the RMIT Business Referencing Guide. So although this is a very personal task, it's about you and your development, we still ask that you write it in a fairly rigorous way and justify things that you claim with literature. That's worth 20 marks. We want clear evidence of input to your leadership plan from an industry leader. So what we'd like you to do is develop a draft of your plan, go to see someone who is already a leader in industry, and ideally the industry you expect to be working in. Give that person your leadership plan, your draft, and ask her or him what they think. Is it realistic? Is it appropriate for the kind of environment that he or she works in? And general information about how long it might take you to develop the kind of skills that that leader has. So what did this person suggest? And what did you change as a consequence of your discussion, your interaction with this leader? We don't want you to submit a transcript of your discussion with this person. We're really more interested in what aspects of the discussion led you to modify or to improve your leadership plan. Now that person can be locally here in Melbourne. That person can be on the other side of the world. We don't mind how you communicate with the person. It might be by email, it might be by Skype, whatever, as long as you've got a discussion going with a person in a leadership role who can advise on tweaking your leadership plan. And like all courses in business, we expect that the report is logical, flows smoothly, has a good introduction, a main body, and a short conclusion. And of course, you must have a reference list at the end, which is properly formatted according to the RMIT referencing style. So that's the written part. The recording, what is it we're asking in this 2 minutes? You can record on any device you like, and we'll work out in terms of technology how we can allow you to submit that via the course website. The important thing is you've only got 2 minutes. And what you're trying to do with this 2 minutes is to sell yourself as a future leader. Now, it's based on your written report, on your development plan, but imagine that you're presenting for a job and the person interviewing you says, we're looking for a future leader. How do you know that you'll become a leader in our organisation? So it's in fact a pitch to sell yourself and your plan as a prospective future leader who is both effective, efficient, and whatever else you decide is important for your plan.
So you've covered the introduction. So this is now part A. It's about foundations and concepts.
Yeah, but maybe just before we talk about that, let's explain the 5 parts, because part A, okay, foundations and concepts. What is this whole assignment about? What are the basic building blocks? Part A. Part B, you've got to decide if you're going to adopt, adapt, or reject certain leadership theories, models, frameworks, and approaches. And that's really quite important, because not everything that you learn in this course is going to gel for you. So you've got to be critical about that. Part C is about you as a person, as a potential leader. What is it about you that's important, unique, different, that feeds into your leadership development plan? Part D is really quite critical, because we want you to go outside of your own frame of reference and find a leader in industry who can give you some feedback on the way you've drafted your plan. And you often get anxious about this because you ask, who do I go to? And the answer is whoever you know in a leadership role somewhere in the world. And we'll come back and talk more about that obviously in part D. And then part E is, how do you pull it all together in time, ready to submit your final report?
And I think you covered something early on about the different sorts of industries and personal interests. What if a person comes up and says, well, in my own personal development plan, I'd like to look at, say, an organization which is an NGO or a charity.
Yeah, I don't think we should be exclusive. I mean, every organization needs leadership, whether it's public sector, private sector, multinational, small local organization. It really doesn't matter. And to some extent, because this plan is about you and your leadership, I would probably recommend that you choose something that's the kind of industry or environment you're likely to work in. So if you're very much about NGOs, then yeah, go and find an NGO leader and talk to her or him. Or if you're an engineer and you expect to work for a big multinational in a mechanical engineering environment, then try and find someone in that kind of environment.
I think there's something that is important in that if you choose a particular sector of the industry, is it also important to make sure that that particular sector is well supported by the academic literature?
I'd like to say yes, but I think it may be difficult to find industry-specific literature that is highly theoretical. I'm sure you'll find lots of information that describes practice in certain industries, but I don't think you'll find a lot of specific information about appropriate leadership theories and approaches for Industry X, in my view. But if you can, then that's great.
Okay. Right, so let's try. Is it okay? We'll move on?
Yes.
So this is part A, Foundation and Concepts. Whoopsie. Right. Leadership, it's complex.
Sure is, isn't
and I think, and essentially what we did in this slide was to do a brain dump of some of the terms that you'll come across in this course. Roles. What's the difference between roles? Roles and characteristics, theories, attributes of leaders. As you pointed out earlier, there's something about culture, the environment, and some of these overlap, of course.
Yeah. And I think the problem is that none of those terms have a specific definition in management.
Yeah.
And like everything else, it's all confusing, it all overlaps. And in this first part of conceptualizing what your leadership plan is about, it's really quite critical to get a sense of what these terms mean and how they're used in the literature, because if you're developing a plan and you've read a paper that talks about appropriate or desirable leadership characteristics, how are they defining the term characteristic? And if you're looking at a theory, is it a theory or is it a model? And so there's a whole lot of definitional stuff to get through before you can actually start writing your plan.
Okay. Right, this is also another one of our brain dumps. It shows some of the feeds that will go into your plan, some of the considerations. And I don't think this is an exclusive list. It's just something that we thought of at that time.
It's the Keith and Ian plan. So everyone will have their own plan. And even Keith and I, when we talked about this, and we didn't agree actually. Sometimes I would say that something's of lesser importance, Keith would say it's greater. And I think that's fine because everyone has a different view of how things fit together. And one of your major tasks in writing the report is to describe quite clearly and logically how you've addressed certain elements and how they interact with each other. So a model like this is important, but your model will look different to what Keith and I have come up with.
And more importantly, I think the point we need to emphasize is that all of this has to be theoretically grounded in the literature. So where possible, go to the relevant journals. If you wish to make a particular point about why you've selected one of these attributes or one of these themes, then make sure that you can support it in the literature to support the arguments and the developments of your plan.
Yeah, to give you an example of how that might work, so perhaps you've talked about gender as being an important influence in your plan. You're female and you think that female leaders are different in certain ways. That's fine, but we then expect you to reference that claim. So somewhere you've read a paper that describes the impact of gender on leadership. So you reference that. Similarly, if it's about leadership functions, according to whom? Is it Mintzberg's idea, somebody else? So where have you drawn that framework or that concept from? So I think as well as being a kind of mind map of how you might start thinking about your plan, each of those labels might also be considered to be a flag for you to go and find a reference in the literature.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one thing we need to point out as well is there are patterns in this and there's good practice. Maybe I could describe it as good practice. These competency models, they are like templates, aren't they?
Yes, in a sense. So we've got three that were provided in my RMIT. So we've got the UK National Health Service model, the Michigan University model, and the UK National Occupational Standards. Now, I've called them all models, but in fact, the authors of those things call them something different. So models is a bit confusing already. But the basic idea behind those is that each of those three documents or tools or models describes the things that are important as leadership functions, tasks, and attributes. So in a sense, they are a plan for leadership. And you might say, well, I'll just use it. But you have to, if you do adopt, say, the UK National Health Service model, you still have to adapt it because it has to fit with you. And you may not be working in the National Health Service. So which parts of that model actually are relevant for your industry or your environment? And it may be that you're quite creative and you take elements from a range of models. And as long as it's logical and consistent, it doesn't matter.
Again, theoretically grounded, so nothing rules you out from developing your model entirely, but that's a considerable effort.
True, Keith, but it's going to be hard to find, this is me saying this, I think it's hard to find a piece of literature that supports the way that you've pulled together bits of models, because that's something, it's a very practical thing that's unique to you. So you won't find an article that says that. You will find articles that validate or test those three competency models. And in fact, those three models themselves are reference points. You can quote those in your paper if you use them.
Okay. So we'll move on to the next one.
I like this formula. Bruce Avolio, engineers will probably like this because it's a very scientific understanding of what leadership is. And the reason, Keith is an engineer too, so it resonates with him. The reason we've thrown it in is because we'd like to challenge you to think, is it possible to render leadership to something like a relationship in quantitative terms? And you know, truly the answer is no. But there must be some kind of connection or correlation between what Avolio says. For example, it says that the big L is the concept of leadership, whatever that might mean. F is a function, and again, that's not defined. Little l is some characteristics of the leader. The GM represents the group members and their characteristics. And S is the setting, environment, we might say culture. So Avolio says you can plug that in, you can have a number assigned to the coefficient, to the variables, and it gives you a number for L, big L. I don't think that's possible.
No. Have you ever seen this actually in action? I don't think there's an example.
No, there's not actually, you know, this person has an L of 7, this other person has an L of 20. Although there are a lot of pieces of research in leadership that do use a very quantitative approach. And the Globe study is a classic example where they do actually render or reduce leadership functions into a numerical outcome and plug it into something like this equation. And so I guess if you've got a very scientific quantitative background, this is quite attractive. If you've got a qualitative humanities kind of approach to life, then you might reject this entirely.
And I think what this slide, it's important to know that this slide is basically giving an example of what one person tries to summarize or embody as leadership.
Yeah.
So there are many other views of what leadership means and how you bound the leadership parameters and how you even measure it if it's possible.
Yeah. But it's a nice notion, isn't it, that you can actually describe your level of leadership, big L, and some sort of quantitative scale.
But it's at the broad level, it's a function of quite a few things. In this instance, the formula suggests that leadership is a function of the leader, the environment, and the group members being their followers. So that's a very nice embodiment of what a leadership, or certainly one person's attempt to embody leadership.
Yeah.